Okay, so welcome to the webinar from the Centre for National Parks and Protected Areas Research Centre at the University of Cumbria, based at the Ambleside campus. And this is our first webinar, in fact, a natural capital lab on an urban fringe, challenges and possibilities. And one of my colleagues joining me on the webinar today to help out is Dr. Jamie McPhie, and it's his fault that we have this topic, because in talking about the Natural Capital Lab, of which there was a great deal of interest around the campus, Jamie threw in the question, what would you learn if you placed one of these rewilding projects with a Natural Capital Lab on an urban fringe? And I thought that was definitely a question worth exploring, and it seems so do a good many of you. So that's our theme. We're going to organise it as a few inputs about the Scottish project to start with, and I'll introduce our speakers in a moment. And then about halfway through, we'll take a 2-minute comfort break and switch to discussion. And I'm hoping that throughout this session, you'll use the chat function to feed in questions for me to put to Jamie, who's going to host that discussion for us with our presenters. And if you want to join in the discussion and not just be a person raising questions, do raise your hand, and I'll try and monitor that as well while Jamie's managing the conversation. I'll introduce Jamie a bit later on. We're here for an hour and a half, by the way, just to give you the overall time frame. So we have 3 speakers about the Natural Capital Lab at the Rewilding Project in Scotland, all with a very good reason to know about it, and I'm delighted to welcome all 3 of them. Roger Leese is going to speak first. All 3 are trustees of the Lifescape Project, which is the organisation managing this enterprise. And Roger's the owner of the Highlands site that the Natural Capital Lab is situated on. And he's also a partner in a law firm, Clifford Chance, LLP. LLP, I don't know what one of those is. Maybe tell us if you need to know, Roger. And among other things, at the law firm, he's responsible for the firm's pro bono and community engagement. Chris White, another trustee, is an associate director of environmental economics at AECOM. And Chris is acting as the project manager of the Natural Capital Lab. Lastly, Ian Convery, Professor Ian Convery, is another trustee and co-chair of the IUCN Commission for Ecosystem Management Rewilding Thematic Group. It's a mouthful. And he is also our Professor of Environment and Society in the Centre for National Parks and Protected Areas. So welcome to all 3. And without wasting any more of your time, I'll hand over to Roger who'll start off the introduction to the existing project in Scotland. Roger, over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris, and welcome to everybody who's joined. The way we thought we would do this is I'll just give a very brief introduction to the origins of the project. Then Chris will deal in more detail with the Natural Capital Lab process itself. And then Ian will give more of an overview of the subject at the end. So my few minutes really is something of, I guess, of a sort of a personal story as well. Like I suspect most people on this call, the natural world has been something that I've loved since being a kid, being taken up to the Lake District in particular, and that sort of carried on throughout my life. This particular adventure, I think, probably again perhaps shared with a number of people here, started when I read George Monbiot's Feral a few years ago. And that started myself and my partner Amelia thinking about whether we could do something ourselves. We've been spending a lot of time up in the Highlands for the last 10 years or so. And so we started looking for a site that we could rewild and contribute directly ourselves. And we got to know a commercial forester who was, though, interested very much in the biodiversity aspects of this and taking what he does further. And we looked at a number of sites and spent quite a lot of time looking because essentially we were looking for a site that we would deliberately select so that we could look to restore it and rewild it. And essentially, in the end, we found the site, which is near White Bridge on the southern side of Loch Ness here, really on the basis that it's big enough, at least approximately 100 acres, to make it something that would be viable, and also because it was a small-scale commercial forest. There was the clear opportunity to turn it from, if you like, a densely packed Sitka spruce mainly site into something different, in particular rewilded with natural species of trees and flora and fauna. When we acquired it, we certainly had the idea that we would look to do a variety of things with it. So not only look for the sort of rewilding of the site, but also think about how the site could add to culture, the cultural aspects of rewilding and of nature, and the ability to use the property for education as well and for involvement of the local community. So those are sort of the sorts of things we had in mind. But it has to be said that those were very vague thoughts and discussions that we'd had. But then alongside this, I've been involved, as Chris has already mentioned, in Lifescape, and along with the other speakers today and a number of other people, we'd recently looked to form Lifescape, the Lifescape Project, as a charity, specifically to work on rewilding projects. And just to say something about that, the thing about Lifescape and its sort of ethos is to bring together people with different skills, and that's why, in fact, what you've got here is you've got academia represented, you've got a law firm, and then you've got a large consultancy in AECOM. And it was the idea of bringing together different people and different skills and different organizations and using those together, which really, if you like, forms the ethos of what we've tried to do. And so when I talked with Ian and Chris and others about this, there were lots of exciting ideas, and essentially it's become a Lifescape project, looking at all of those different aspects. But in particular for today, Chris was the one that came up with the idea of using the Lifescape, so using the property as a natural capital laboratory. And the idea there is to use innovative techniques to try and capture the benefits of a project like this, so that it can clearly be demonstrated to the community and to the wider world, hopefully on the encouraging others to do the same thing and others to see those benefits and to try and make them more concrete and capable of explanation. So that was something that my wife and I immediately said, that's fantastic, let's get started. And since then, Chris has really led the way in terms of developing and actually starting to implement the project. So I think that's all I'll say. And with that, I'll hand directly on to Chris.
Thanks, Roger. Just check you can see and hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. So share some PowerPoint slides, if that's all right. Okay, can I just check you can see the slides now?
Not yet.
Okay, sorry, let's try again. Can you look now?
Yes.
Brilliant.
That's good.
Great. Okay, so this is a hopefully quite relatively short 15-minute overview of the Natural Capital Laboratory project, which I just described, and goes into a bit more detail about the kind of research and technologies and things we're doing on the site. So I'll go through a quick overview of the site and then touch on some of the topics we've been looking into and some of the areas where we've been researching around remote sensing, drones, VR, capitals accounting. So where we are, it's a beautiful spot in the Highlands, up near Whitebridge, as Roger said. There's a little map there to give you a bit of a sense of where we are in the world. It's about 45 minutes an hour from Inverness and just below Loch Ness as well, nearby. And there's broadly four kind of core pillars of the project. So the first one, which Roger's been talking about, and Ian will pick up a bit later, is around rewilding. So the idea is to take this piece of land and look at restoring the ecosystems that used to be there and allowing them to function in a way that they would naturally, so that they can look after themselves, and then also to start bringing back species which play important ecological roles in the functioning of those ecosystems. And at the same time, trying to engage people and in the local area and wider region in rewilding and connecting to the environment. And then the sort of natural capital laboratory element is all about trying to capture and reflect and demonstrate the benefits or the impacts of the changes on site as it's rewilded. There's three kind of parts to that. The first one's around data collection. So, I mean, one of the things that AECOM has a lot of is kind of large infrastructure projects where they're using these kinds of technologies like drones and robotic rovers and thermal imaging cameras on big infrastructure projects. What we wanted to do on this was try to apply these technologies which are used in other sectors into the environmental sector and develop ways of better collecting and analysing data. And so the idea of the laboratory element is to cover the site in as many sensors and technologies as possible and collect as much data as possible that we can use to monitor the change over time as the site's rewilded. Then the sort of second pillar is around capitals accounting. So we don't just want to collect information, we want to take it and then analyse it and use it to measure those impacts and be able to communicate to people what the impacts are. And we're particularly interested in trying to measure and quantify and value the environmental change, but also the social impacts and the economic impacts. I mean, rewilding is often a controversial topic, and I think it's really critical to these kinds of projects to be able to understand what happens environmentally. So what happens in terms of the carbon sequestration, what happens in terms of water quality, air quality, species diversity, but also what happens to communities in terms of their perception of the area, trusts in the project and people working in it, and also in the economy. So what does it mean for local jobs and local incomes? So developing capitals accounting frameworks where we can measure the costs and the impacts of the project each year and understand how that's changing over time and looking at where the rewilding process is creating value. And then the third element is to try to go beyond what we'd normally do, which is technical reports and spreadsheets that nobody wants to read or look at, to try and take this information and make it more accessible and more engaging. So developing things like digital platforms, virtual reality experiences, and trying to make these kinds of projects more interesting to people and get people more engaged in understanding why rewilding and these kinds of projects can be very beneficial. So bandwidth willing, here's a very short video of the site taken from one of the drones on the site to give you a sense of what it looks like and what we're talking about. I just find it's quite useful to have something in your mind when you're talking about a project, so you can link things to it. So yeah, there's a house on the site which you just saw, which is kind of used as a base for research and operations and people staying on site for recreation and artistic opportunities. There's a road running down the middle of the site, and on one hand there's quite a lot of plantation woodland, and the other there's a large area of clear fell, and also some kind of regeneration just on the border of the clear fell area there. So you can see here, I mean, visually there's quite a lot of impact from the clear felling, and you can already see some of the trees regrowing. There's a river also that bounds along the site. This is a 3D model which is taken from the drone footage, which we're using in analysing and monitoring the site. That's a very quick overview of what the site looks like. It's about 100 acres, so not very small, and one of the not very large, but one of the advantages that size provides means that we can get a really detailed and good understanding of exactly what's going on across the site. So we're about 18 months into the project at this stage. I'll touch on some of the key things we did in year one now, and then sort of finish with a quick overview of what we're working on at the moment in year two. So year one, it was mostly a case of trying to understand what's going on the site. Can we put together a baseline before any of the real sort of rewilding starts in practice? So there's a lot of baseline surveys, and then using that to put together a natural capital account to understand the extent and condition of the natural capital assets, the flows of ecosystem services, and the values that they're providing. Then we started looking at some of the technological applications around virtual reality, remote sensing, and the use of drones to monitor and understand change, as well as starting to look into issues of social capital accounting, whether we can start to quantify and measure and understand social impacts and relationships with communities and other stakeholder groups as part of this sort of capitals accounting framework. So to start with natural capital accounting, I presume most people will have some understanding of natural capital, so I don't want to go over this in any great detail, but just to give a sort of broad overview, what we're talking about in natural capital is that this idea of in standard financial terms and thinking, people think about assets such as factories providing flows of services over time that then provide value to organizations and society. And the idea of natural capital accounting is to take this framework and apply it to the environment, and to start thinking of the environment, so areas of woodland, as really important natural capital assets that, if you maintain them in good condition, provide really important flows of ecosystem services, such as storing carbon, regulating water flows, improving air quality, but then have real important values to society. So this may be reduced damage from flooding, improved health and well-being from access to open space, or it could be benefits in terms of reducing carbon emissions. And so what we did with the site was start to put together a baseline natural capital account. So this takes this model of assets, what condition they're in, what extent they are, the flows of services that are being provided, and the values that are being generated from those services. One of the things we were interested in doing in the lab was to try and take something which you can see on the left-hand side of this image is traditionally a sort of Excel-based, quite number-heavy and off-putting exercise, and try and turn that into something more accessible and more web-based and more visual. So we developed this idea of a digital natural capital account, which you can all access online if you want to see it, which allows you to have a sort of virtual tour of the site, explore the different areas and understand the assets within the ecosystem, what condition they're in, how they're functioning in terms of the values of services provided. And a key part of this was trying to understand whether we could link up that analysis to better and more efficient ways of collecting information and presenting that visually. And then just to touch on the idea of social capital accounting, a big issue in rewilding is often around community trust and participation and buy-in to schemes like this. And what we wanted to do was to develop an approach whereby we could think about social capital in the same way as natural capital. And so we came up with a social capital account for the site, which is a sort of a similar social baseline. And the idea is we're looking at relationships with different groups as important assets, which, if they're maintained and looked after over time, provide flows of services. So, for example, building up trust between groups. And then these services have benefits to the functioning and lasting of projects and organizations and infrastructure. So So we've also been working on this idea of social capital accounting and looking at whether we can start to quantify and measure in numerical terms things like well-being and trust and happiness. And one of the things we did early on in the project was to cover all the volunteers and a number of sensors and ask them a number of well-being questions at every moment of the day. This was during they're in the office and at home. And although it was a very small survey, just for this quick bit of research, we found you could actually see in physical terms a significant impact on people's well-being in terms of being outdoors and active and volunteering and on the project. So when people were volunteering, they reported lower levels of anxiety, higher levels of happiness, satisfaction, feeling worthwhile, as well as physical reductions in blood pressure and pulse rate. And so we're using these techniques to try and see if we can start to measure and understand and quantify some of the benefits of people interacting with the environment. Another strand to this was trying to make data collection cheaper and easier to do. It's expensive to collect information, and it can often be a barrier to environmental projects. Sending out scientists with clipboards and measurement sticks it takes a lot of time, resources, especially in remote areas. So we're really interested in this idea of being able to use remote sensing information to collect data and analyze it at distance. And this has become increasingly relevant during the kind of lockdown pandemic when we can't really get out to site and do much there. So one of the things we've been looking at remote sensing on the site. So you can see in the middle there, that is a phase 1 NVC survey put together by the ecologists on site. And then we've been testing different remote sensing techniques to see if we can replicate what the ecologists have done using a combination of AI and satellite data. You can see on the left-hand side, the first approach we used was not particularly accurate. We had a broad sense of the types of habitats, but it wasn't anyway close to getting it right in terms of where habitats were exactly on the ground. However, with sort of more refined techniques and developing the process over time, you can already start to see on the right-hand image that we're getting much closer to being able to replicate what ecologists are doing on the ground with remote sensing and algorithm techniques. You can see there that we're starting to get a much closer degree of accuracy in these types of techniques. And what we're really interested in understanding is how good these techniques can be and how they can be used to better improve sort of conservation monitoring and implementation. We've also been looking at drones and whether we can use drones on automated fly paths around the site to act as sort of remote monitorers of change and look at how things are changing over time, how vegetation is changing, what the condition of that vegetation is. So there's a number of drones which regularly fly over particular routes along the path. And as touched on that video, which we presented at the beginning of this presentation, the drone imagery lends itself to being able to produce these sort of 3D models, which you can then use as static snapshots of the baseline of a site. And you can then look at how things are changing over time, what the implications are about potentially restoring peatland in one area or planting trees in another and seeing how the site changes over time. And then also the other sort of nice thing about drones is that they lend themselves to sort of these beautiful panoramic sweeping landscapes of the Highlands, which allow you to get a sense of what the landscape looks like. And then another aspect we've been looking at is around sort of the virtual reality. So one thing we're acutely aware of is we're not going to have a fully functioning, Caledonian forest on the site in the next 5 years. It's going to take a long time before we get there. And what we're really interested in is whether we can use things like virtual reality to take stakeholders to the site virtually and get them to see what things might look like in future, depending on the land management decisions we make today, and allowing them to get a sense of what rewilding might look like under different scenarios, to see and experience those landscapes for themselves, and then to be able to have more sort of informed and measured approaches to how they want to shape the landscapes around them. So for the lab, we took a number of sites on the site which were linked to kind of key points of ecological change. So in some of the old birch woodlands, the plantation woodland, the Clearfell area, and the river on site. Then took a series of 360-degree cameras. I'll just go through this quickly, which allow you to record a picture in a sort of circular shape, put it into a virtual reality system, and allow you to look at what the site looks like at the moment. And then using this as a model, the next stage, and this is kind of currently a work in progress, is to start looking at how these sites are going to change over time and use the virtual reality to recreate ecosystems with the help of the ecologists and put together how these ecosystems might look like and sound like, crucially, so that people can experience them and kind of get a feel for the sense of the types of things that look like. And we found that virtual reality has been a really effective tool of being allowing people to understand and experience what rewilding might look like in different scenarios, and give a sense of the fact that the landscape is not a static thing. It has many sort of options about what it could look like, and the decisions we make now will shape the landscape that we grow up in. And then finally, in year 2, there's a number of other bits of research that we're currently working on. So one of the aspects of doing is a sort of deep dive into the aquatic side of the site, so going into the river and doing a number of ecological surveys, and then using eDNA analysis to look at how we can monitor change in the aquatic environment over time. We're also looking at doing some boring and monitoring of groundwater levels to look at peatland condition and depth, and looking at how much carbon is stored in those peatlands, and how managing and restoring the peatlands could lead to improvements in carbon. And this idea is looking at whether we can use things like peatland and forestry as nature-based solutions for helping to meet net zero targets, and starting to look at what the potential costs and benefits of those types of approaches might be. We're also looking at species monitoring. Again, we have a squirrel monitoring project on site, but it takes a lot of hours of walking in the rain every morning at 5 a.m. looking up for squirrels. So we're really interested in this idea of setting up remote camera traps and audio moths to monitor and record changes in species density and populations over time without having to send people to the site to do it. So that's another piece of work that's undergoing. And then also we're looking at what species used to be in the sort of ancient Caledonian forest ecosystem, what ecological roles they used to play, and then which species are missing from the site and may play really important ecological roles in helping it to return to the sort of natural processes which it would otherwise have had. And so hopefully developing a short list of potential species that we could bring back to the site to play important ecological roles. And finally, also updating the accounts so we can see each year how things are changing and where the sort of impacts are lying across the rewilding project. And that is everything. So if I could just hand over now, I think, to Ian.
Chris, before you hand over, Ian, before you pick up, we've got 2 or 3 questions specifically related, quite detailed questions to the that assessment process. Maybe we could put those to Chris now. Would that be okay? As Nicholas Atherton's asking, which model of natural capital accounting did you use? And Neville Maccan's asking the same question about the social capital accounting.
So the natural capital account it follows the corporate natural capital accounting framework, which is developed by DEFRA and the Natural Capital Committee in the UK. It's a pretty good and comprehensive approach to measuring and valuing and understanding changes in the natural environment. What we've done for social capital, essentially, when we started, and still to this day, I don't think there is no similar framework in place. So what we've done is adapt the corporate natural capital accounting framework into a social capital setting. So developed a similar structure for understanding capital assets in a social capital sense, and the flows of services and how you could measure and value those. What we're doing in year 2 at the moment is extending that approach out to human and intellectual capital. The idea being we'll have a sort of full 6 capitals approach using a standardized, consistent framework that allow us to look at environmental, social, and economic impacts and how they're changing over time.
That's great. And one more very specific question about your the pulse rate measure. How does pulse rate indicate a benefit?
So we started that piece of work as a sort of ongoing exploration into how we can better understand and measure social capital. One of the things we were particularly interested in was this idea of well-being and being outside in the environment, and whether it has like physical benefits and sort of mental benefits. The mental side was done based on standard kind of well-being questionnaires, and then because we had access to some pulse rate, blood pressure trackers, as well as sleep monitors, we decided to monitor those factors as well. How much that actually tells you is still open, and we're likely looking into that. But where we started on was like, could we start to measure these things, and what information and data could we start to track that would tell a picture? And is there any sort of measurable impact of doing these sorts of activities that we can start to capture? So yeah, very much an ongoing area of exploration.
Interesting to find out how that works. I was imagining a sort of before and after, and yeah, it'd be good for people like me who want arguments to stop taking their statins. If you've got a link to the natural capital accounting info, and you could post it in the chat, that would be great, Nicholas. I'd appreciate that. If we can't do that, we'll add it into the follow-up email, Nicholas. Ian, hopefully you've got control now of the posting function. I think I should have given that to you.
I think I have, Rick. You need to give that to me.
I've just done that, so hopefully you have. Maybe you could. Can't even find you in the guest list now. There we go. Making you a presenter now.
Okay. Still not there, Chris. Okay, brilliant.
Good. Yeah. Over to you. Thanks, Ian, for giving me a space to take those questions for Chris.
Okay, I'm just seeing how I share screen from here, Chris. I should have this worked out by now, you'd think, but it's saying okay. I'm still not getting share screen, Chris, anywhere.
On mine, it's a button next to the microphone.
Yeah, it's not coming up on mine. There we go. It's on now. Okay, hopefully you can all see the screen.
Yeah, that's looking good, Ian.
Super. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack and give a bit of an overview of rewilding and talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing with the IUCN around rewilding. And the link here is, of course, because the Natural Capital Lab have recently adopted the IUCN rewilding principles, and because the site is at a reasonably early stage of restoration but is aiming towards rewilding, I thought it was useful, one, to talk about the principles, but two, to then talk about this kind of trajectory or continuum, really, from restoration through to rewilding. It's start with some rewilding fallacies and just kind of kick them into the long grass. So the things that often come up when people talk about rewilding it's about looking backward. It's about trying to create something from the past, an ecosystem from 1,000 years ago. No, of course it's not. Ecosystems are dynamic, they're constantly changing. It's about looking forward, particularly in relation to challenges such as climate change. It's about trying to rewild everywhere. Well, that would just be plain stupid. We all still need food and key commodities like timber. That's got to be grown somewhere. So it's not about rewilding everywhere. It's about a more integrated, connected approach to landscape management. It's anti-farming. No, of course it's not. That links to the point I've just made. And it's anti-people. Again, I disagree with that. It's about rewilding nature, but it's also about, and this is slightly hippie, I guess, but it's about rewilding ourselves. It's about a kind of paradigm shift in terms of how we see and relate to the other species with which we share the planet. And the idea that it's just about bringing back carnivores such as wolves and bear. Well, species reintroductions can be an important part of rewilding, but that's got to be context specific, and it's got to be driven by science and ecosystem function. So there we go. That's what it's not. What is it? So the first real use of the term was back in 1990. It was Jennifer Foote. He used it in a Newsweek report, but the first kind of meaningful use was Dave Foreman, and then people like Michael Soule and Reid Noss, and particularly Soule and Noss in the paper Rewilding and Biodiversity kind of lit the blue touch paper in terms of thinking about rewilding and what rewilding can offer for conservation. And the classic kind of Soule, Noss, Foreman approach to rewilding, the kind of North American tradition of rewilding, is this 3 C's approach. The 3 C's being core areas, connectivity between those areas, and the role of large carnivores in regulating ecosystems. And because carnivores tend to need large areas and movement corridors, that's how the kind of 3 C's work together. I'm going to come back to the 3 C's and offer you an alternative version of the 3 C's a little bit later on, but let's kind of park that there for the moment. And then talk about, well, what is rewilding, or why rewilding? I know I'm kind of preaching to the converted, so I'm going to skip through much of this, but it's probably worth going through just for context. And I suppose the key point to make is that the current model of conservation isn't working, particularly the kind of fortress conservation approach of fences and fines and excluding people. And there's a whole bunch of evidence that suggests that isn't working. Not least the kind of current species extinction crisis. We know about that through, sadly, through a whole bunch of ongoing reports, whether that's the WWF Living Planet report, the State of Nature report. Living Planet is international, of course. State of Nature is UK focused. The IPBES report, British Mammal Society reports. We know about this from a whole range of different sources. Most species aren't covered by protected areas. They're not living in protected areas, so they're living in the spaces that humans also occupy. And most ecosystems continue to degrade. And even those in protected areas continue to degrade because often they're not big enough to accommodate and to respond to the change that we're experiencing at the moment. And they're certainly not big enough to accommodate fully functioning food webs in most cases. And those boundaries tend not to be very flexible, so they're not very good at accommodating change. So just to give you an example of why perhaps fortress conservation isn't working, the graph on the left shows the number of protected areas globally, going back to the first national park, Yellowstone in 1872, through to kind of more recent times. So over the last century or so, you can see an exponential increase in protected areas. Yes, they've been important, but we're still experiencing massive levels of biodiversity loss. So in and of themselves, they're not a solution. And that's partly because what we've ended up with is a series of kind of islands of protection, which, going back to 1872 or the early part of the last century, national parks, protected areas didn't have the same level of human stuff right up to often the boundaries of the parks themselves. That is the case now, and they've become isolated. So very quickly going through the Living Planet Index. Again, sorry, telling you stuff that you already know, but 60% decline over a range of terrestrial, marine, and freshwater indicator species over the period 1970 to 2016. So a massive level of biodiversity loss at an international level. This is pretty much replicated at a national level as well. Very similar trends for Living Planet Index, State of Nature report. IPBES saying that we risk losing 1 million species over the course of this century. Most of those species are not found in protected areas. So this is a slide from which looks at protected areas and biodiversity in Kenya, showing that only 35% of the species are within protected areas. Most of those species are outside of protected areas, in the spaces between them, in the spaces that human people live and have settlements and have agriculture and have everything else. I always show this slide and I kind of make no apologies for that. I nicked it from Michael Sule a few years ago, and to me it's pretty astounding. This shows Earth's land mammals by weight. And I don't know how clear it is, but the dark grey stuff is kind of humans. The light grey are pets and livestock, so the kind of species that we tolerate. And then the green are wild animals. And in that slide, you've got all of those reasons for the biodiversity crisis I've kind of very briefly outlined. You've got habitat loss, you've got fragmentation, you've got overexploitation of species. So what this points to is the need for change, for a transformative change in terms of how we live on this planet, essentially. And I'll highlight there a paper from Science from last year, which talks about how this decline is essentially human-driven, and what we need is transformative change. And without becoming a bit too evangelical, this is what rewilding can offer. It's a new approach, and the three C's, the old three C's of core areas, carnivores, and connectivity. We might think about those again and reflect those in terms of contemporary times as being about connectivity, coexistence, and then also the importance of core conservation areas. I'll say a little bit about the work of the Rewilding Thematic Group, which was set up in 2017 to try to bring together some of the kind of contemporary thinking about rewilding, to draw on that North American tradition, but also to look at rewilding elsewhere. In Europe, but elsewhere in the world as well, and as much as possible to try to come up with a common basis for developing and understanding the concept. From an IUCN perspective, this is important because it allows the IUCN to then go forward with how rewilding can fit into various areas of IUCN practice, whether that's SAM priority areas, whether it's things like nature-based solutions. So to do that, we carried out a lit review. We talked to a whole bunch of rewilding pioneers. We developed a set of guiding principles, and they've been tested and tested again in various workshops. And we've revised this continuum model, which talks about how you move from the process of restoration to rewilding. And I'll talk about that in a few slides' time. But to very quickly offer you this new definition of rewilding, which comes out of the work with the IUCN Rewilding Thematic Group. It's the idea that rewilding is the restoration of functioning native ecosystems, complete with fully occupied trophic levels and nature-led. These ecosystems should be self-sustaining where possible, requiring minimum, if any, kind of or no human intervention. And recognizing that ecosystems are dynamic. Rewilding shouldn't exist in and of itself. It has to link to other concepts and other approaches within conservation, whether that's a CBD ecosystem approach, whether it's stuff like nature-based solutions and natural capital as well. But essentially, it's about the process of rebuilding native ecosystems, usually following major human disturbance, to create a complete food web at all trophic levels, as a sustainable and really resilient ecosystem, using species that would have been present had that disturbance not occurred. What does that mean in practice? Excuse the Mandarin, I give this talk to Tsinghua University last week. So it's about using wildlife to restore trophic interactions. That almost inevitably involves some kind of translocation of either apex predators or keystone species. It's got to be big. It's got to be about connectivity for the free movement of species and enabling that coexistence of wild species and humans in an integrated space. It's about local engagement and planning and support and a participatory approach to conservation. And whilst it's about understanding ecological process and can be based on reference ecosystems, it's got to look forward and recognize that ecosystems are dynamic and constantly changing. One of those key changes, of course, is looking ahead to the potential impacts of climate change. It takes a kind of knowledge pluralism approach in that it's about scientific knowledge, but also about local indigenous knowledge as well. And those two, and that has got to be on an equal footing. The paradigm shift for me comes in this recognition of the intrinsic rather than the instrumental value of all species. And that is part of this process of the kind of paradigm shift, essentially from a very anthropocentric view of the world towards one which is perhaps more biocentric. It's adaptive. It's based on monitoring and feedback, which for me is where natural capital comes into this process. And it offers the opportunity for a paradigm shift in the coexistence of humans and nature. That was a very quick run through a set of reasonably complex principles. If you want to know more about that, they're available on the IUCN SEM Rewilding Thematic Group website. I can give a link to that. The principles are there as a download. They're also coming out in a paper soon in British Wildlife, which Steve and I have written, and also a paper in Conservation Biology, which is kind of going through the system at the minute. I'm running out of time. I'm sorry about that, Chris and Jamie, so I'll try and speed up, but I'll just, again, very quickly, I want to talk through maybe what rewilding is in relation to some other kind of key conservation terms that are relevant to the NCL. So at a very basic, simple level, we might talk about ecological restoration as about returning an ecosystem back to the way it was. Reintroductions can be part of that process, returning a species back to where they used to be, where they used to live. And then the rewilding comes in terms of returning that managed area back to the wild, with taking away, reducing the level of human impact, the level of human management over that area. So there's a lot of debate in the literature about rewilding and ecosystem restoration, and are they just one and the same things? And without going into too much detail, a whole bunch of papers have been talking through this kind of recently, perhaps most famously a paper by Hayward. Some of the responses to that have really highlighted where maybe those key differences are. And for me, a key difference is the fact that whilst all rewilding is restoration, not all restoration is rewilding, because rewilding emphasizes and promotes this autonomy of ecological process. It's a kind of controlled decontrolling, if you will, to try to promote nature to take control, to reduce this human agency. So Steve and I have kind of worked on this diagram for some time. This is the rewilding continuum. And what this talks about, and I think this is relevant to the NCL, but also to Jamie's idea about having an NCL in an urban area, is what does a kind of landscape, what does a landscape look like? And, you know, not every, as I said at the start, not everywhere in the world can be wild, and you know, that would be desirable for everywhere to be wild. Landscapes vary in their degree of modification and naturalness. What is important to me is a need to have a kind of more integrated, joined-up approach to how we manage, or perhaps don't manage, landscapes. And we might think about restorations being human-led, nature-enabled, and rewilding as being about nature-led, human-enabled. So this is very much part of this idea of the kind of control, decontrolling. Restoration gets us to the point where actually nature should be able to take over. And those natural processes, the building blocks should be in place for that ecosystem, that landscape, to be largely self-managing. So this diagram, this is the revised version of the 3 Cs, which is about core areas, connectivity on different levels, landscape connectivity, but also connectivity in terms of us as a species and how we relate to other species and landscapes that we live in and amongst, and coexistence. And this idea of connectivity and a joined-up approach is kind of really important when looking at restoring and ultimately rewilding a site. And this is very much kind of what we're about with the NCL. How do we get connectivity back, not just within the site, but across the site and various parts of that site, the human stuff alongside the natural stuff. So we might think then about restoration as being kind of human-led, nature-enabled, as I said. At the restoration phase, it's about human interventions kind of dominating, from planning through to practice, and the restoration of the ecosystem and species translocations where necessary. This is kind of very much the classic Society for Ecosystem Restoration view or definition, the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. it's too simplistic to think about it in this kind of linear way, but I'm going to for the purposes of this afternoon. Rewilding can then come in when the building blocks have been put in place, and we get to the point where the ecosystem has been necessarily has been restored. The building blocks are there to enable that ecosystem to be self-willed and nature-led, and we can then get into that kind of decontrolling phase where we start to withdraw human management, and which of course at the same time there has to be a level of evaluation and monitoring to make sure that the site is working, and that perhaps again is where natural capital come in the natural capital accounting process. So it's not as simple as a kind of linear as this kind of linear model suggests, but there's a strong relationship, a strong link between restoration and rewilding. For me, these two diagrams, the rewilding continuum and the 3 C's approach, are very much kind of two sides of the same coin, essentially, because what they point to is the need for kind of strong core areas for protection, but also a recognition of the need for coexistence rather than human domination over nature, and that's going to be vital if we're going to address the current biodiversity crisis. So it's the spaces in between, which I think Chris and Roger have both alluded to, that are really kind of important often in conservation work. And if we take I suppose, thinking through that 3 C's approach and thinking about it in terms of a wildlands network, we can see the core areas there. We can see perhaps some connectivity between those core areas, but it's the stuff in between that can be really important. The areas where ideally there should be compatible use. So it's the agriculture, the industry, the settlements, the brownfield sites where all this human activity takes place. How do we get to a point where that's integrated and we get a connectivity and a coexistence, so we can start to address the biodiversity crisis? And what that calls for is very much a paradigm shift in the way that we relate to nature, and how we move away from a anthropocentric worldview towards something which is more biocentric. And you might question that, I suppose, in terms of where natural capital comes into that, because of course by its very nature natural capital is an anthropocentric intervention, and that's perhaps one of the questions we might pick up in the panel discussion. So I'm going to leave you with this cartoon by Robert Crumb. Robert Crumb is perhaps best known for other kinds of cartoons, some of which are vaguely pornographic in nature, but this is kind of quite interesting, and what he does here is present a short history of America, which goes through the kind of pre-European wilderness, through phases of development. Last century, where that development speeds up, we're into kind of modern capitalism and conspicuous consumption. And then he kind of added to this cartoon at the end in terms of kind of what next. And he talked about, or he draws actually 3 different scenarios for the future: a kind of ecological disaster, a future, a techno-fix future, and an ecotopian solution cartoon as well. And I guess that's where we're at the moment. What does our future look like? And to some extent, what can tools like natural capital do in terms of moving us towards what will hopefully be a brighter ecotopian future? Also, of course, Rod Nash in Wilderness in the American Mind is a very similar thing in terms of thinking through potential futures. Okay, I'm going to leave it with one final provocation, which is, even though I fully believe in the opportunity presented by natural capital, a question often arises, which is, if neoliberal economics and capitalism are at least partly to blame for the climate biodiversity crisis, is natural capital simply throwing more of the problem at the problem? Again, something which we might pick up in the panel. Sorry I run over time there, Chris, but over to you.
Ian, thank you. Thank you to Chris and to Roger as well. We have a couple of minutes either for you to take a comfort break and or to start putting your comments and questions into the chat box for, and then in probably just before 3 o'clock, I'll bring Jamie forward, and our panel will be up and ready to engage with the discussion. What would happen if we put a rewilding area in a natural capital lab on an urban fringe? What would be the opportunities and the barriers to that? So a couple of minutes to catch your breath and write your questions. Okay, folks, let's begin the discussion. We have half an hour and we have some questions rolling in, which is great. And I think I'll just introduce my colleague, Dr. Jamie McPhie from the Outdoor Studies Department at University of Cumbria. Jamie is the program lead for our master's program in outdoor and experiential learning. Jamie, you had the joy of fielding these questions and organising the taming the wild 3 presenters. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear. Can you just nod, Chris, if you can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So thank you. Yeah, this question of how would it look in an urban environment is a bit of a deceptive one as well. If we're looking at the false dichotomies of things like urban versus rural and that sort of thing, or nature versus culture. But I wondered what the benefits and or issues might be, you know, if it was involved in more of an urban setting. And so I'll just introduce this very, very briefly, and then I'll start with a broad question for Roger, Ian and Chris to answer, if that's okay. So starting the introduction to this first question, and then I'll bring in other questions from people that are coming in thick and fast at the moment as well, is now there are more humans in urban environments than what we perceive of as rural environments, and many rural environments aren't particularly biodiverse anyway. If you think of Roger, you mentioned George Monbiot's Feral in there. He talks about sheep-wrecked landscapes, for example. Some might say the urban is everywhere, especially in countries like the UK, where we arguably have no so-called wilderness left. Hammond and Thrift suggests that the city's everywhere and in everything, and that traditional divide between the city and the countryside has been perforated. So regarding the ecological and social benefits, which is my main sort of area of concern, I guess, there are still issues of social and environmental inequity with rewilding and conservation projects and schemes, from colonialism and displacement of many indigenous peoples around the world to accessibility issues that involve class and race. and evidence shows that it's still mainly white middle-class people who utilize these rural spaces, such as national parks, and due to accessibility issues, often as a residual effect of white supremacists, such as David Foreman and John Muir, for example, who've been sort of targeted as white supremacists, for example. And there's lots of evidence for that too. As closer to home, though, for example, the poet William Wordsworth opposed the train reaching Ambleside in the Lake District, as it had Windermere at that time, to protect its natural beauty, which at the time was a cultural construction or becoming one, from the hordes, he called it, of working classes. Wordsworth explained in a letter to the press that members of the working class would not have the capacity to appreciate the beauty and character of seclusion and retirement that the Lakes District had to offer. His letter to the Morning Post on the 9th of December in 1844 stated, "It can only be produced by a slow and gradual process of culture." So what we're talking about, or what they're talking about here, is an elite epistemological accessibility to certain landscapes, an accessibility to an elitist construction of knowledge, in other words. Jorgensen states that, taken as a whole, rewilding discourse seeks to erase human history and involvement with the land and flora and fauna, and such an attempted split between nature and culture may prove unproductive and even harmful. A more inclusive rewilding is a preferable strategy, they say. And I can see from what you've talked about so far that you are trying to conduct a more inclusive version, for example, than a lot of previous versions. So involving a question by Nigel straight away, Nigel Dykes said, how do you incorporate indigenous practice, for example? I guess for me, allowing the Shoshone sheep-eaters, the major keystone species, not wolves, back into Yellowstone is the ethical, natural response, surely. And with that in mind, this is the major question that I'm going to pose to you, if that's all right to start with. What might the benefit and value be of a natural capital lab on an urban fringe? Because I can see benefits. Can I put that across to, well, if any of you would like to answer that first, please go ahead.
I'm still trying to understand the preamble to the question, Jamie. But so what do you want us to respond to the question around indigenous peoples and relationships with nature, or to the one around an urban NCL?
Well, I think they're probably linked in that, and that's what I was trying to get to at the start. That often people from either minority backgrounds or in this country, it's usually non-white, non-privileged people who have less accessibility, and there is an urban-rural divide there as well, for example. And so one of the solutions that's been put forward is to suggest taking these rewilding ideas to the urban fringes, for example. So I guess that they're related in one way in terms of social inequity, or social inequity related to access to environmental sort of landscapes.
Maybe if I respond to the kind of the indigenous question, and then Chris or Roger could
I could say something on that.
Nigel's just also added to that. Indigenous may be the local, as per your slide here, is added that as well.
I mean, I think one of the big criticisms of contemporary conservation and the kind of fortress model of conservation, which I talked about in my bit of the presentation, is the exclusion. And that goes back to the first national parks, back to Yellowstone, and as you say, the exclusion of a whole range of different North American groups, not just the Shoshone sheep-eaters, others as well. And there is access back for many of those tribes now, but it's too late and it's insufficient. So I would absolutely agree with that, Jamie. And I think that model of the kind of fences and fines type approach, I think, is at least partly why we have the crisis in conservation that we do at the moment, and at least partly why we have a disconnect to the natural world in the way that we do. So I think that's absolutely an issue which we have to address. And my take on rewilding is that that's going to be part of the approach. And it can be very tokenistic, or it can appear very tokenistic, and just sticking a word like indigenous knowledge or indigenous practice or traditional ecological knowledge into into something doesn't, it has to be followed through, and there has to be real meaningful engagement with a whole range of different kinds of community and kinds of knowledge, if we're going to address the crisis that we have. So that was a very quick response, and I suppose saying yes, I agree with you.
Well, if I could come in next, I'd actually perhaps just respond to what you said as well, Ian, and then maybe talk about the sort of the urban rewilding point. Because I mean, it's an issue which in and of itself I think we could talk for a very long time about, and then hopefully do some things. But I think it's pretty clear that the approach over the last 100 years or so has been a failure in many cases. And certainly, what we have seen in terms of successes has been where local, if we want to call them local communities or indigenous communities, essentially are empowered, in the process, and where, if you like, their role in the future and the benefit that they'll gain from rewilding or conservation, is clear. And that is though something where there's always going to be issues to be debated, because often though that does mean the indigenous population or indigenous peoples changing their ways of life, in part, if for instance you're talking about pastoralists, and the where from a scientific perspective, their activities in the changed climate, for instance, is leading to desertification. It's not really necessarily the right thing to say of how do we make sure they never have to change. And after all, over at least 50,000 years of history, cultures do change, and what people do and how they make their living changes as well. And I don't think that's going to stop either. So I think there are all those sort of points to take into account, but in particular, take a concept from human rights, which is free, prior, informed consent, which is becoming very central to if you like, to human rights discourse around how. In particular, a state or indeed private enterprise should behave and ensure that in relation to its activities, it obtains the free, prior, informed consent of the local population. And I think that's something to take into account very much here. In fact, quite frankly, as a matter of law, being the lawyer here, that is an international obligation, which would as much apply to taking land away from people in, say, Uganda, which is where there's some issues around this at the moment, actually, to create a reserve, as taking it away to start mining, for instance. It's no different. On the second set of issues and challenges that you talked about there, I mean, one thing is, I think is, it is very important that you talked about, Jamie, is this issue of for whom are the wide open spaces and who benefits. Now, I suppose what when people talk about that, what I always immediately springs to mind is that both of my parents were working class people in the urban environment of Manchester in the 1940s and 50s, and they met through the CHA, which was then strong at the time, that took mostly working class people out to the nearby Lake District and Derbyshire and the Peak District to walk and to ramble. And of course, as we all know, the sort of access to the countryside movements that were happening around the 50s was very much a working class activity as well. And so, I think that first of all demonstrates that the great thirst for, if you like, the outdoors and for nature amongst the working class through population as a whole, but also the issues faced. I mean, there, of course, it was around landowners not wanting them. When it wasn't about Wordsworth, it was about, and it is still about, landowners that do not want people on their land. and they want it for themselves. I mean, I'm in Scotland at the moment, and the statistics here are absolutely incredible in terms of who owns the land and why and what they do with it. And quite frankly, I'd say here it's a disgrace. And that's something to be tackled. But then
Yes,
talking about the sorry, go on.
Same. Sorry, I was going to jump in very quickly and add to that there's another question from Diane Conley saying that land ownership's a major barrier as well to urban fringe rewilding too.
Yeah, completely.
Connectivity aspirations.
Completely. I mean, actually, where my office is Canary Wharf, which has created its own environment. And I look out of my window, and it's quite nice that they've put in a few trees and some grass, but it's private. It's heavily controlled, and it's certainly not in the slightest rewilded. And actually, I suppose you could contrast Central Park in New York, where quite a lot of it is quite wild. I think the simple thing though is that there are lots of spaces, particularly within a lot of UK cities, where there are small pockets, and I work and live most of the time in London, and actually certainly compared to Manchester, which is where I was brought up, the spaces are incredible, including quite a lot of nooks and crannies that are quite wild and that people really love and take advantage of. It's a little place just down near King's Cross on the side of the canal, which is probably no more than an acre. But they've deliberately allowed to be wild, and actually back to many of the questions about the interaction with people. People go there and get an awful lot out of it, and that's what we need to try. But as it says, there's big issues about ownership, and of course about what we see as being wild, and that's another issue, isn't it? As I said, looking out at Canary Wharf and what's seen as, well, that's green, that must be wild, mustn't it? That's what we mean by nature. And again, all the land that perhaps is available, but is immediately treated or regarded as wasteland, which is a prime site then for development, rather than in a different way. In other words, development using concrete, not using trees. So I think those are a few of the issues. I think it's a very important thing to look at and something that can be done, but there are some significant barriers.
Diane asks as well, do you see any evidence or optimism for a change coming through in environmental legislation or changes of priorities, for example? Any biodiversity gains, for example?
Well, that's exactly it, isn't it? I think, well, I suppose there are two types. And actually, I know Chris can come in here because he's quite an expert on this. I have to know, but perhaps, and I'm going to reveal my colours here. Perhaps one of the only benefits to coming out of Europe is we're no longer bound by the Common Agricultural Policy, and we do have the opportunity to look again at land use. And we've got, great sort of campaigners along that, like Dieter Helms, who are actually quite close to the centre of government, looking at those sorts of issues and what we can do with our land. And that is a cause for optimism if we get it right. Although we're already seeing some backtracking from government, in relation to these issues. But that's certainly, I think, one cause for optimism. And then, in general, regulations that are coming in, which are really caused, of course, by the climate change crisis, which are really looking to create, probably both carrot and stick around businesses being able to demonstrate that they are offsetting the negative impacts of what they do. And actually, I was just involved with in a conversation yesterday with some of my colleagues at work who see, as a result of these changes, an immense increase in the number of nature-based projects that businesses will want to invest in order to gain what would essentially will be offsets in relation to their activities. And certainly yesterday I felt very optimistic. In fact, I was talking about the potential for some of that money to come into Lifescape. So I think there's going to be a lot there. or there's potentially a lot there, and certainly my colleagues who know more about it than me think that we will see at least significantly greater resources, in other words, cash being available. And it's going to be, for the likes of everybody on this call who are involved, who can, if you like, create and run projects that seek to grab as much of this likely capital for the right things as opposed to the wrong things, because certainly in the past, in for instance, in relation to carbon credits and carbon trading, a lot of the money has gone to waste. At least as we would regard it, has gone to waste in terms of the amount of it that's gone into proper successful projects. But I think we perhaps got an opportunity that we can seize. If we can create the projects, there may be money for them, is I think the way I would see it at the moment.
Okay, I've got another couple of questions popping up, if that's all right. If we can move on to those, I'm just being aware of the time as well. Chris has answered Chris Reed's question part in part about the artistic collaborations, for example. But also Heather Lancaster asked about what's the natural capital value associated with the well-being measures in the rewilding project in Scotland. I would also move that forward and say about the well-being measures in potential of urban environments as well. And that also brings us on to Neville Macken's question: do we need to stick with the terms of rewilding and natural capital when engaging people in co-designing at the urban fringe, as it might be a barrier, for example? So could anyone answer that regarding the well-being measures and the rewilding project in Scotland, and then maybe move it on to the urban as well, and maybe thinking about the terms of rewilding and natural capital?
I'm happy to talk to the terms, but maybe Chris wants to come in first around the measures question.
Sure. I'd say in terms quickly as well that terms are just like words, and you should use whatever words are effective in communicating with the people you're trying to communicate with. I mean, it's just whatever's effective. In terms of the well-being thing, there's a number of emerging approaches about trying to measure well-being and look at the values it has. It broadly fall into ones that look at sort of like personal well-being and how that affects people's happiness, mental health, and their sort of life satisfaction, and looking at the value it adds to their enjoyment of their life. And then also the sort of like more utility focused ones of what are the impacts of lack of well-being on the NHS and costs to businesses and loss of government tax revenues, and the sort of external costs if your population are unhappy and unhealthy. And so there's a whole growing, emerging like literature around that. They're not particularly sophisticated, but you start somewhere and then 10 years later you get better and better, and then you have something that's increasingly workable. I think where it's interesting in the natural capital kind of fringe idea, and something touching back on the first question as well, there's some good work from Ian Bateman about 5, maybe 10 years ago, I can't remember, around the UK NEA, the UK National Ecosystem Assessment, who's looking at the locational significance of ecosystem services. And basically, if you're putting a woodland next to an urban area, you get much more ecosystem service value in terms of things like recreation, well-being, and air quality than you do if you're putting a forest in the Highlands or in the Lake District, perhaps. And he very strongly pushed for like more nature-focused provision of more sort of urban-focused provision of those kinds of areas. I think there's good and bad about natural capital frameworks. I think what's good about them is this idea of once you're measuring something and pinning it down with a number and reporting on it, it's hard to wiggle away from the impact of what you're actually doing. And I think there's a particular advantage around the social capital thing about recording things like equity of access. One of the things we're doing on the lab is looking at who visits the site, what's their ethnicity, what's their disability status, what's their sort of class, and like building that record of like what kinds of people are visiting the site. And it tells you a pretty clear picture. I think we already have, there's a lot of talk about this, but there is an issue around access to these kinds of areas in the UK. It's a certain small subsection of society. I think measuring that and communicating it and highlighting it is key, and addressing it as well. on the addressing point of this data plug, we're very concerned about this in Lifescape, and one of the projects we set up is called Wildside, which it basically rests on this idea that if we're going to actually protect biodiversity, we can't rely on a small subset of society being the only people who access it. At the moment, wildlife watching is predominantly a very small subset of society, and as a consequence of that, the people that are in conservation who've had those experiences and access to nature are a very small subset of society that's not representative. And what we need to do is to make wildlife watching and interaction with biodiversity something that is accessible and is part of everyday activity and for all society. And Wildside is very much about making wildlife watching accessible to people and starting with those experiences with everybody rather than just a small group.
I'm just going to move on quickly, if that's all right. Thank you for that, Chris. Adam Eagles asked, how would we measure the benefits of megafauna and predator presence on an urban fringe, and could these outweigh the potential conflicts and costs? And that question, I'm thinking about, it doesn't necessarily have to be megafauna, because there's a huge amount going on in an urban environment, in a biome. I mean, you think of the biome of a street, for example. You know, the city streets have their own biomes with which alter temperature, wind speed, albedo, animal behavior, including humans. And I'm not just talking about buddleia, for example, but the concrete as well, the buildings and the spaces in between the buildings. They have the specific biomes which we need to recognise and build on, especially integrating urban ecologies into these sort of systems of thinking. So based on that, Ian, you mentioned in the text box, words represent ideas. Within a community of language users, it's important that words be used to convey the same meaning. But there are often very different meanings to different words. We all have different understandings. And nature in many cultures doesn't exist, the term itself, for example. And so when we talk about nature in an urban environment, we often think flora and fauna, or even megafauna, as Adam Eagles asked the question about, and how could we measure it, for example. But, you know, isn't it also the human produce? So a termite mound with its clever artistry and design and air conditioning, similar to a skyscraper of human design with air conditioning and artistry, for example. Why would one be natural and one not be natural? Is there a more nuanced perspective, perhaps, then, that we could bring in to a conversation regarding bringing these natural labs into urban environments that incorporate the human elements too?
Do you want us to respond to Adam's question, Jamie, first?
Yes, please, if that's all right.
Chris or Roger, who are best placed to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, well, essentially,
benefits of megafauna and predator presence on
yeah,
urban.
I think, well, I think that the sort of two perhaps connect together, and actually, then it does come back somewhat to terminology and what we're talking about here, because certainly a core feature we would say, or I would certainly say, of rewilding is restoring ecological function so that nature can, if you like, manage itself. And certainly the current view at the moment, the latest views, you know, when we look at NEP and, you know, and we look at, I can never pronounce it, but Oost, what it is in the Netherlands, you know, emphasizes that in order to restore ecological functioning, which can work without human constant intervention, does require megafauna to be part of that. So I think Adam's question is a good one, in the sense of that's a difficult thing. If you want to have that sort of non-human based, if you like, functioning, you do need that range, including the megafauna, who, for instance, you know, make sure that it doesn't all just turn into one big you know, forest, for instance, and you have that patchwork that we all talk about now. And then you've got the balance. How can you do that within the urban environment? If we haven't got that, then in some ways I think we're thinking again as to whether we're really talking about rewilding, or we're really talking about sites which require a higher degree of human intervention in order to manage. And you know, I think certainly from the Lifescape perspective, we've debated this, and we think that you know, the the perfect should not be the enemy of the good, to use that expression. So you know, we do see great benefits to you know, to if you like, projects that allow the greater prospering of the you know, of nature, if you want to put it that way, even if it doesn't, if you like, fulfill some people's definition of rewilding. I think that's the way I would answer that question.
Could I just add very quickly in a practical sense? I think we shouldn't be limited by what we can imagine can work. I think a great example is Nairobi. We do a lot of work out there at the moment. And Nairobi National Park, it's incredible. It's in the city centre. It's full of lions. It's one of the best rhino sanctuaries in the world. And, you know, people are living alongside them. It can work. You know, humans are incredibly adaptable species, and our cultures can adapt in ways which can make these kinds of situations work for everybody.
And there's a great program on a few years ago called Human. I forgot what it was called again.
Human Planet.
Yes, that's right. And that showed you the different, so the peregrine falcons and the foxes and the pigeons, and you know, and for example, you know, with you know, how they interact in these city environments as well. And Charlie Bell, we're just running out of time. I'm very aware of that. And I know I can't see Chris Loynes at the minute, but I can see his eyes boring into mine. And in my experience, Charlie Bell says that, oh, I've just lost it again. There are already huge problems relating to farmer landowner perception and understanding the terms rewilding and natural capital, and the terms seem to have negative connotations outside of the conservation bubble. And Julia Allingaby says, Charlie, I'd agree with you. There are, though, keeps popping up and down, although different words can be used for restoration, rewilding, light, giving natural processes a greater role. Anything else? Brian suggests we've had some megafauna here today in the form of Boris Johnson. Seemed quite interested in our near rewilding event. Most locals were either in awe or fear of the power of the Mersey. Great. Yeah, Boris Johnson is, I mean, he's a keystone species, I guess, if we're talking that language, isn't he? In many ways, but not necessarily a very positive one. It depends on your perspective there, I guess. We have just come to the end, and I have to wrap it up there if that's all right. And there are some others. You know, thank you very much. There are some conversations there that could keep going on and on and on, I'm sure, as well. Especially Ian, in response to me, I would completely disagree, by the way. But that's one to be continued. But I'm going to pass back to Chris to finish off, if that's all right. Just because we've run out of time. I am right that we've run out of time, aren't I, Chris?
You are indeed, Jamie. My eyes are doing that boring thing.
Yeah. But to be continued with lots of interesting conversations and debates.
Indeed, because it does seem to me that coexistence third of the model that Ian presented to us is at the heart of our discussion here, and that by placing whatever we call it on the edge of an urban fringe, where ecosystems are flourishing and vibrant and at scale, would have a massive potential for reorienting people towards a sense of coexistence in the kinds of ways, whether it's Nairobi or London, that two of our speakers there spoke about how those urban populations actually do relish that connection with wildlife and with ecosystems and a breath of fresh air. Thank you so much to Jamie for hosting that conversation, and for all the people who asked questions, and apologies to anyone who hasn't had a chance to get their question in. I think we've covered all the ones that did come up in the chat box, though, so that was good job done. Thank you so much to the speakers from the Lifescapes Project, to Ian, Roger and Chris. And thank you to all of you for attending. I will be in touch with you in a few days, asking for feedback, and also to share the recording link with you. So have a good day. The sunshine has just come out here in Ulverston after Storm Christoph. So something's going in the right direction. Take care, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Chris, as well.
Thank you, everyone.